Hello chess friends, here is Vadim Milov, and today I'd like to talk to you about exchange sacrifice, about exchanging the rook for a knight or the bishop. So let's look at the first example. This is the position from the game Reshevsky against Petrosyan, played in the year 1953. This is a well-known game. It's black to play. And first of all, as usual, before taking a decision, we have to try to assess the position. So obviously white has not such a great bishop on b2, but on the other hand his pawns d4 and d5 can move forward, and in particular the move e5 e6 currently can be a very unpleasant threat. On the other hand, black pieces seem to be doing okay, but the knight on c6 is very far away from blockading the pawns e5 and d4. For example, knight would belong to the square d5. But the question is, how can the knight come to d5? Or, for example, knight could be transferred to e6, but it's difficult, because for the moment the rook is standing on d8, and so the threats e5, e6, or d4, d5 can become very unpleasant for black. And this is the reason why Petrosyan, who was a great master of exchange sacrifices and in similar positions, played a very good move. Rook e7, e6. So let's look at the idea. What is behind this move? Does it make sense for black to give up the exchange? Well, the idea is quite simple. Black stops white from playing e5, e6, and at the same time, and although black is not very happy to give up the exchange, but Petrosyan assumed that it's worth giving up the exchange in return for possibility of playing this maneuver, knight e7, d5. And it appears to be that white can't stop it. So in the game, white did not take immediately on e6. He played a3, a4. Bishop e6 wouldn't change much. Black could have taken on e6 with the pawn, then play knight e7, knight e5. Or with the queen, which is not bad either. The idea is the same, and the point is that the bishop on b2 is not doing very well, and the white is running out of active ideas. After putting the knight on d5, black can play rook c8 and then prepare b4, and black pieces are very active here. So if we go back in the game, white played a4. Assuming that after b4, d5, this pawn on c4 is going to get lost, assuming this line. Pawn takes, queen takes c4, and the bishop will be alive soon after c takes b4. So this position would be acceptable for white. So this is the reason why Petrosyan rejected playing this natural move b5, b4, and simply played knight to e7. White took, takes, and even though that white managed to free his bishop, for example, white has an idea, after a4 white has an idea of playing bishop a3. Black position is very much acceptable. For instance, knight d5 is the idea here. So in the game, white played queen f1, knight d5, rook f3. Here b4 is not possible because the pawn on c4 is hanging. So black played bishop to d3, with the idea queen f2, then b4, and black pawns are very strong, and queen a4 is a threat. For this reason, Reshevsky decided to give up the exchange in return, and here black has to be a bit careful because white is still a pawn up. And for example, in case of b takes a4, then after c4, white center, 3 pawns against 1 can become very unpleasant. For this reason, Petrosyan didn't take on a4. He played b5, b4. Now the pawn on a4 is hanging, and I assume after c4 black goes back to b6, and white can't protect the pawn on a4, and at the same time black is holding the blockade against these 3 pawns. Also after queen a8 c6, this pawn on c4 can become vulnerable. It will be attacked several times. So the position is actually good for black. So in the game, Reshevsky took on b4 instead of c4, what we looked at just now. After a takes b4, he played a5. Now rook a8, controlling the pawn, and white is still a pawn up in this position, but the knight is very good on d5, and the pawns on these pawns d4 and d5 are actually worthless, and the position is about equal, but if anyone can be better here, then it's black, not white, because knight on d5 is much better than the bishop on b2. So rook a1 here. White is trying to bring the bishop to d2, restricting the knight on d5. So, queen c7. Bishop d2. Now black just wants to exchange the pawns, a6 and b4. So he played b3 here, h6, king h8, and the draw was agreed because after queen a6, rook a6, rook takes b2, pawns are getting exchanged, and the position is equal. So as we have seen in this game, by sacrificing the exchange, black didn't win this game, but he was able to stabilize his position and restrict white's play in the moment when white was threatening to play e5 and e6. So in my opinion it was a very good positional sacrifice. Now let's look at the other example. This is the position from the game The Firmian against Ivanchuk, played in the year 1989. It's easy to see the opening was the Sicilian defense. In this position white played quite an obvious move, queen to g3, threatening bishop h6. And this move has another idea. For example, after king h8, then knight g4, and by playing knight g4, white is fighting for the square d5, because knight on g4 is going to eliminate one of the controllers of the d5 square. So in this position Ivanchuk played a great move. He took on c3 with the idea, obvious idea, to take on e4 with the knight. So black is going to give up the exchange plus gain one pawn. So here taking on c3 with the pawn wouldn't change much, because after knight e4 black has a great position. Took knight e4, here f5. We see that during the last few moves the position has changed completely. Though white won the exchange, black has a very strong center, pawn center, two bishops, and potentially his pieces are very active. All his minor pieces, like two bishops and the knight. At the same time, white has no counterplay. White has no pawns in the center, and it's not very clear where white is going to organize the play. So he played knight f1, here bishop h4, weakening the position even further. Now pawn on f2 is hanging. In case of rook e2, bishop c4 would be played, and if g3, then knight g5 with a very unpleasant threats. For instance, after g takes h4, check, knight e1, and black is going to win the queen. So, like in the previous example, white, after bishop h4, white chose to give up the exchange in return, give it back. So bishop f2 was played, king h2, of course not king f2 because f takes e4, winning the queen, king h2, pawn takes, queen d6. This is the position white was aiming for, because now finally bishop on c3 can get some play, because this pawn on e5 is likely to fall, and after queen e5 white pieces can become active. But on the other hand, e4 pawn is very strong, and black is going to have the initiative in the center thanks to the e4 pawn. So in order to keep the initiative, black played bishop b3, playing with tempo, and e3. And after queen, he played queen f7 with the idea, after knight takes e3, to play rook e8 and win this knight. So instead of knight e3, white played knight g3, but it doesn't change the evaluation of the position. To rook a8, queen d6, bishop c4. This pawn is actually unstoppable. And after rook a6, white position is hopeless, and he resigned after a few moves. Now let's have a look at the other example. We are going to look at the game Lothier against Anand, played in the year 1997. So let's see this game from the beginning. c5, c4. Theory goes without a lot of comments. So e5 was played in the game. White has to play actively, otherwise the knight on a4 is going to be in trouble. So takes on a5, knight e5, bishop f4. And in this position Anand played knight g6 and gave up the exchange. Well, actually black doesn't have much of a choice in this position, because as shown by Anand, for example, knight fg4 is not a good idea in a view of this line. Bishop g3, knight e3, and after knight f1, bishop e5, and white should be winning, because the knight on f1 is trapped. And bishop d6 is not a good idea either, because the bishop on d6 is going to be in trouble very soon. Now black has a lot of problems here. So it's much better and also safer to give up the exchange. So bishop e8, queen takes b8. White took on b4, trying to free his knight in the future. Bishop b4, here, castles. King h1, d8. Here we see that black threatening anything immediately, but because white doesn't have good squares in the center, black simply puts his pieces on a good position, and white is getting outplayed. Knight c5 was played in the game. For instance, Anand shows this line in his comments. Bishop a7, and this potential pin can be very unpleasant. Bishop e8 and e5 is a very strong threat here. Or for example the following line. If knight c3, then bishop e8 immediately. White is in trouble again. So knight c5 takes, and bishop b5, attacking the rook, and the knight is pinned. It's very important to note that the potentially unpleasant bishop on b3 is completely useless here because of these pawns, and it's often worth it to give up the exchange in order to keep this bishop on b3 passive. So in the game, again, white chose to return the exchange and play rook f6. Well, after, for example, after rook f3, queen b6, white pieces are completely unprotected. So rook f6, pawn takes, queen g1, bishop a8, knight e6, takes, and after a5, well, black is a pawn up and has a much better position. His king is much safer because there are more pawns around the king than around white king, and black won this position in a few moves. So again we see that the decision to play knight g6. So again we see that the decision to play knight g6 here was a very good decision for black.